Welcome to PressTV News Analysis. I'm Kaveh Takhbai. An alleged Iranian plot to kill the Saudi ambassador to Washington has grabbed the headlines. But if true, why would the Iranian government want to do this? U.S. officials have so far presented relatively scarce evidence, which may be followed by sanctions. Well, in this edition of the News Analysis, we'll discuss the motives that the U.S. has to make this allegation and whether this may be a move by the U.S. to divert attention from its own domestic problems, like its nationwide protest movements, amongst others. Well, let me introduce our guests. We have Middle East expert Christopher Walker joining us from London, American philosopher and professor emeritus at the University of Minnesota, James H. Fetzer, who joins us from Madison, and former CIA officer and executive director of Council for the National Interest, Philip Giraldi, joining us from Washington. We also have a professor of the University of Tehran, Professor Mohammad Marandi, who joins us from Beirut. Well, gentlemen, thank you all. Let me go first to you, Professor Marandi. What would Iran gain from the alleged plot, especially at this juncture of time? You have the Middle East region in which it's witnessing popular revolutions, toppling U.S. allies.
Well, I think that's the whole point. Iran would gain absolutely nothing. The only country that really gains out of this is the United States by making these accusations. The Iranians, first of all, they've had 32 years of a difficult relationship with the Saudis, but has existed. But never, even during the war when Saudi Arabia and the United States and the Europeans supported Saddam Hussein, gave him weapons of mass destruction to use against Iranians, never did the Iranians even attack a single Saudi anywhere in the world. On the other hand, let's assume that the Saudi diplomat was a target. Why him? He's not a high-ranking Saudi prince. There are many more important than him. And why in the United States, in D.C., where security is higher than most other parts of the world? There are many ways to attack more important targets, if anyone wanted to do so, in the Middle East, including Saudi targets, which would be much more easy and create a much smaller reaction. So it's obvious that the Iranians were not behind this because A, the Iranians have no motive, B, it would be completely irrational. And then there's the third element about the story itself, which we'll discuss later, I'm sure.
Okay, yes, we're going to discuss obviously many alleged facts on this. Let me bring you in, Christopher Walker. You just had Professor Marandi pretty much set up the scenario here. Tell us what you think. What would Iran have to gain?
No, it's very, very hard to see. This whole alleged plot has the smell of a sort of B movie in it. The fact that it was supposed to employ Mexican drug runners, that there haven't been any explosive discovered, and I totally agree with your previous contributor that if, for some reason or other, far-fetched as it may seem, that the Iranians had wanted to target a Saudi target, they certainly wouldn't pick probably the most secure capital in the world and one of the lesser well-known Saudi members of the connection with the royal family. They could pick a far easier target in a far softer place. So this all looks to me, I'm afraid I'm a bit of a conspiracy theorist when it comes to elections in the States, and this just happens to have been announced as President Obama's personal ratings dropped to their lowest point ever, and it's been shown that any Republican, it doesn't matter who, they haven't chosen a leader of the Republican Party yet, could and would be likely to beat him. So what better way to clear the headlines and get rid of the bad news that all these demonstrators are taking to the streets all over America about the corporate government than to have a bit of saber rattling against those hated enemies, the Iranians, and sort of put something up in the air that really is hardly qualifies with the name of a balloon. I mean, it's just, I haven't heard anybody who believes a word of it.
Well, that's the whole thing, too, isn't it? That many people are not believing this. I mean, even the U.S. media, the Washington Post, even has doubted the story and cited its own evidence. But let's move into some of those facts that perhaps remain very doubtful in terms of the credibility of this. And I'd like to refer to Justin Raimondo, who's the editorial director of the website antiwar.com. Which he says, how is it that these two Iranians just happened to meet up with a Mexican drug cartel assassin who just happened to be a longtime DEA informant? I mean, is there any response to this question that's posed by this editorial director, James Fetzer?
Everything that's been said so far is completely accurate. We appear to be witnessing the resurrection of Operation Northwoods, in which American operatives would commit crimes like assassinations and bombings and blame them on Fidel Castro in order to justify an attack on Cuba. Hillary Clinton has said that this idea of contacting a Mexican crime syndicate killer to bring this about is so unbelievable no one could make it up. But the fact is, it's a transparently fabricated event. Not only does Iran have no motive whatsoever, but if Iran were to perpetrate such an act, it would do so in a stealthy manner. It wouldn't rely on someone like a drug killer whose confidence could not be assured. Besides, he's in Mexico. This is supposed to take place in Washington. And the reasons appear to be very obvious. Number one, to distract from the public uprisings. But number two, the Attorney General, Eric Holder, has been on the hot seat because of his blunders in relation to Fast and Furious, where the United States wound up giving large quantities of military weapons to these very drug lords. And then in the third place, of course, it exacerbates tension in the Middle East, which means that this is being promoted by the allies of Israel in the United States, the neocons. The situation is completely ridiculous, and no one who knows anything about intelligence matters would take it seriously.
Well, let's bring in Philip Giraldi here. Philip Giraldi, again, we need to expand on the allegations and the details behind it. Let's assume that the Iranians really were plotting to kill the Saudi ambassador on American soil. I mean, would they contract it out to the Mexican mafia, send all kinds of, well, traceable money, wires from Iran to the U.S., and not care if they killed 100 Americans in the process of achieving this goal? I mean, Philip Giraldi, give us your impression as a former CIA officer about the circumstances that have arisen and presented to us by the Americans.
Well, I mean, first of all, I agree with all the previous speakers that Iran had absolutely no motive for carrying this out. And then I would add, as a former professional intelligence officer, that all the details that have surfaced about this operation are ridiculous. No professional intelligence service, whether from Iran or anywhere else, would ever have run anything like this. Which is not to say that there isn't a kernel of maybe truth in this story, that maybe somebody was plotting to do something and was doing it in a very stupid way and came to the attention of the Drug Enforcement Agency and eventually to the FBI. We have like a missing chapter here, which is the past 9 months, during which period the DEA informant clearly was in contact with one of these gentlemen, and we don't know to what extent the situation was manipulated by him to turn what may have started out as nothing and turned it into a case that could be exploited by the government to make its case that it's being tough on terrorism. So there are a lot of little stories here, and there are a lot of things we don't know yet. But I would absolutely agree that I can't imagine there is any way that the Iranian government could have been behind this.
Okay, Mohammed Marandi, Eric Holder has claimed that he has evidence that implicates Iran in this alleged assassination plot. Before I pose my question to you, first let's take a look at this video, and then I'll come back to you.
My second purpose today is to provide you with additional information, to share with you what the United States knows about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, as well as Iraq's involvement in terrorism, which is also the subject of Resolution 1441 and other earlier resolutions. I might add at this point that we are providing all relevant information we can to the inspection teams for them to do their work. The material I will present to you comes from a variety of sources. Some are U.S. sources and some are those of other countries.
Or knew then what we know today, that there were no weapons of mass destruction, I would have had nothing to take to the United Nations. The National Intelligence Estimate, which was the basis of my presentation, and, by the way, was the basis of the information that was given to the Congress that caused them to vote a resolution of support 4 months before my UN presentation. We rested our case on the existence of weapons of mass destruction that were a threat to us and could be given to terrorists, making it another kind of threat to us. I think without that weapons of mass destruction case, the justification would not have been there, even though Hussein was a terrible person. Human rights abuses abounded. He was cheating on the UN oil for food program.
Well, there you have it. The former U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell, Professor Hannity, in 2003, and then in 2007. In 2003, he was making the case for the war against Iraq with too much emphasis on the U.S. intelligence. And then 4 years later, when he repudiated the same intelligence, well, that only brings about one conclusion, and that is, can the intelligence the U.S. says be trusted anymore?
Well, I think you should also add that even at that time, public opinion did not believe the United States. People knew the truth, and that's why millions of people were rallying in London and throughout the world, really. People were completely opposed to the war. No one believed the evidence. They knew that the United States and the UK were fabricating this information. Before I begin a brief discussion about the case itself, I just want to point out that I agree with what your previous guests, a couple of them, said about the United States really having serious trouble at home and abroad, and it's basically trying to distract attention away from its own problems. But let's look at the story itself. First of all, this Iranian allegedly speaks to a hitman in Mexico and tells him that I have a cousin who's a general, an important general in Iran. Why in the world would a person who wishes to carry out such an attack give such information to a hitman, to a mercenary? That is utterly implausible to believe. On the other hand, later on when he speaks, when he's in custody, he allegedly again speaks to his cousin, who is this general and a commander, on the phone, and his general tells him to carry out the alleged assassination. Would a general, would a senior commanding officer say such a thing on a phone, on an international line, to the United States? It's again completely implausible. Third, the fact that money was sent, it was wired, $100,000 if I'm not mistaken. Over $10,000 would go under clear scrutiny of the United States, and any money by an Iranian to Mexico or to Mexicans would definitely be traceable. So these make the story almost completely implausible. And as one of your guests also said, the drug lords in Mexico, they have their own world, and they make billions of dollars, and they would not attempt to kill a person for $1.5 million and mess up their billions of dollars of profits, because that would create an enormous response from the United States. And if the Iranians were actually after such an operation, which is again impossible to believe, they would know about this sort of thing. We have our own drug lords in Afghanistan, thanks to the United States. Drug production in Afghanistan has increased 30-fold over the last decade. So the Iranians know very well how drug lords work. So the story is completely implausible. It's more like a joke. But if you look at the Western media, they automatically believe the story, and they're now talking about why the Iranians have carried out this attack. They don't ask questions, and I think that shows the independence of the Western media.
Well, the problem that comes about here, Christopher Walker, please tell us how it is that you have a country like the United States, and they have been blamed for making false accusations before on Iran, can come about, present this in court, and provide their own version in terms of the allegations, And then the U.S. Defense Secretary of State Hillary Clinton trying to rally support behind making moves towards Iran, which may result, if it hasn't already, on sanctions. Now, isn't that illogical? And more importantly, is that legal?
I don't think it's particularly legal, but I mean, that doesn't often worry the government of the United States, as some of the prison tactics in Guantanamo Bay have shown us. But I think what doesn't surprise me is that they're all in this together. It's obviously got some sort of purpose. It must perhaps be a blend, as we said earlier. Take the U.S. attention off the domestic economic mess. Let's focus that searchlight back to some familiar territory that we don't like. Then we've got, there's Iran. Let's stir something up on them, and at the same time provoke. I mean, because this can't have gone down terribly well in Riyadh with the Saudi rulers. So this is, I see a bit of mischief here in sort of getting the cage rattled in the Middle East at the time of the Arab Spring, and making sure that Iran, if possible, Iran and Saudi Arabia don't make any overtures towards each other, and leave America in the middle as the sort of the big ruling bear. But it's symptomatic, really, all in all. And I think that the fact that all your contributors have agreed on this, it's a joke. No intelligence agency in the world, and certainly one that's not one like the Iranian that's got a good, if somewhat shady reputation, would act. Can you imagine? I mean, this would have James Bond laughing all the way to the bank.
Well, James Fetzer, is really the United States so desperate to turn attention away from its domestic policies regarding these protest movements that they had to go to this extreme? Tell us whether it is the case, if we put it in that context, or is it that, I think Christopher Walker alluded there, that perhaps there's a connection with Saudi Arabia placing pressure on the U.S., since relations obviously are not at its best with Iran?
I think this case illustrates the maxim that in Washington, the bigger the liar, the further you go. Eric Holder has been on the hot seat for this fast and furious business. This is another attempt to make him look good, to salvage his reputation, just as the use of troops in Pakistan in the feigned attack on the compound to kill a man who died on December 15, 2001, was staged to elevate Obama's poll standings, reduce attention to his birth certificate issue, and justify having those troops there, where we're using Predator drones to kill 140 innocent civilians for every target. It's embarrassing to say, but listening to Colin Powell, I'm reminded not only did we find no weapons of mass destruction, but even George Bush himself would eventually admit Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11. In independent investigations by the Pentagon and the Senate established that Iraq had not been in collusion with al-Qaeda, and even our own FBI would eventually admit that they had no hard evidence that tied Osama bin Laden to 9/11. I'm sorry to say that this kind of fakery and pseudo investigation is disgracing the United States, and if Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden and Barack Obama are standing behind it, then they are going to be candidates to replace the three stooges.
Philip Giraldi, ultimately, let's look at this. As far as the U.S. using this as a pretext to eventually attack Iran, let's look at some of the posturing. First, the Pentagon, after the news broke out, came out in the past few hours and said, well, this needs a diplomatic, not a military response. And then, on the other hand, you had the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton talk about Iran needs to be more isolated. But in particular, chances of U.S. attacking Iran, what do you think?
I think they're very low if the United States is the one making the decision. But if Israel were to stage an attack, then I think it's inevitable the United States would get drawn in. But I think there's something everybody's missing here. Leon Panetta was in Israel last week, and I think it's generally accepted that Panetta warned the Israelis that the Obama administration does not want Israel to unilaterally attack Iran. And every time the Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense goes to Israel and gives them a warning about something, you usually see within a few days something happening to basically tell the Israelis, but we're still on your side. I rather suspect the timing of this whole thing is going back to the Israelis to make a case to put more pressure on Iran. And I think that's the quid pro quo that we're seeing here. Don't attack Iran, but we're going to put more pressure on them, and we have this story in the pipeline that will enable us to do that. So I'm just speculating on that. I have no specific information on it, but I think it's something worth thinking about because you see this pattern repeated over and over again. And certainly the Israelis, of all the players in this thing that we're talking about, are the only ones that really have a strong desire to go to war with Iran. I don't think anyone else, even the United States, has any serious desire in that direction. So I think this is something we should be thinking about.
Okay, unfortunately, so much more to discuss, but we've ran out of time. Thank you very much. That's Philip Giraldi, former CIA officer, with the statements. Thank you so much from Washington. Also, I'd like to thank Professor of University of Tehran, Mohammad Marandi, who joined us from Beirut. Middle East expert, Christopher Walker, thank you. He gave us the statements from London, an American philosopher and professor of emeritus at the University of Minnesota, Duluth, James H. Fetzer from Madison. And of course, you from watching, don't forget to send us any questions or emails. Newsroom@presstv.ir is our address. From Mikhail Tahway and the entire team, it's goodbye.
The Iranians even attack a single Saudi anywhere in the world. On the other hand, let's assume that the Saudi diplomat was a target. Why him? He's not a high-ranking Saudi prince. There are many more important than him. And why in the United States, in D.C., where security is higher than most other parts of the world? There are many ways to attack more important targets, if anyone wanted to do so, in the Middle East, including Saudi targets, which would be much more easy.
Hello, welcome to Press TV News Analysis. I'm Kaveh Tahway. An alleged Iranian plot to kill the Saudi ambassador to Washington has grabbed the headlines. But if true, why would the Iranian government want to do this? U.S. officials have so far presented relatively scarce evidence, which may be followed by sanctions. Well, in this edition of the News Analysis, we will discuss the motives that the U.S. has to make this allegation and whether this may be a move by the U.S. to divert attention from its own domestic problems, like its nationwide protest movements, amongst others. Well, let me introduce our guests. We have Middle East expert Christopher Walker joining us from London. American philosopher and professor at emeritus at the University of Minnesota, James H. Fetzer, who joins us from Madison, and former CIA officer and executive director of Council for the National Interest, Philip Giraldi, joining us from Washington. We also have a professor of the University of Tehran, Professor Mohammad Marandi, who joins us from Beirut. Well, gentlemen, thank you all. Let me go first to you, Professor Marandi. What would Iran gain from the alleged plot, especially at this juncture of time? You have the Middle East region in which it's witnessing popular revolutions, toppling U.S. allies.
Well, I think that's the whole point. Iran would gain absolutely nothing. The only country that really gains out of this is the United States by making these accusations. The Iranians, first of all, they've had 32 years of a difficult relationship with the Saudis, but has existed. But never, even during the war when Saudi Arabia and the United States and the Europeans supported Saddam Hussein, gave him weapons of mass destruction to use against Iranians, never did